want to now transition to a critical question for all of us, and that is the balance between security and prosperity. We can't have prosperity ultimately without some level of security. I remember the first time I visited Pablo Restrepo in Colombia in 2008 to recruit Colombians for the first Kin Global, being in a coffee shop, and the young lady that was meeting with me at one of the meetings said, "Isn't it great we can meet here in this coffee shop?" And I looked around and I said, "Well, yeah, it looks like a nice coffee shop." And she said, "Oh, you don't understand. I forgot. It was your first trip. A few years ago, we wouldn't even walk down the street alone. We couldn't have a meeting in a coffee shop without being concerned about our physical safety. How do you build a business? How do you create an 1871 in an environment like that? How do you become a story who creates beautiful things for us in an environment where security is not assured?" So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague and friend Ben Jones, who's going to lead a discussion with some distinguished guests on this topic. Ben?
Thanks, Rob. Let me invite the panelists to the stage with me. Matt Spence, we'll be hearing from. Matt Spence is until very recently the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Pentagon for Middle East Policy. Pleasure to have Matt here. Matt, have a seat. Matt, prior to that, was in the White House as the Special Assistant to the President around some international economic affairs in the National Security Council, and has also been the Senior Advisor to the National Security Advisor in the White House, including time when we were there together. Selena Aurelio is now a professor at the National Defense University and has worked in many national security roles over time, including being the director at the State Department for counterterrorism finance, of course, which is a very interesting subject I want to delve into together this afternoon. And finally, just-in-time.
Just-in-time delivery.
Exactly. Rob was talking about just-in-time inventory early on.
That's right.
Juan's flight was diverted to St. Louis not long ago. And I'm quite surprised to see him here, frankly. But he somehow managed to get here.
Ben, good to see you.
Very good to see you. Juan is the former Deputy National Security Advisor in the second Bush administration. Also was a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, where he's one of the leaders in innovating the kinds of financial mechanisms that the United States uses today in various kinds of international security matters.
Thank you.
Okay, what a great panel. Please join me in welcoming them today. Okay. So it's a pleasure for me to join you guys. I've been actually looking forward to this conversation, and I think the topic is prosperity and security, of course, is a critical one for us all. Now, to start with a sort of open-ended question, I'm an economist, so when I think about prosperity, and I think about the growth and the improvement in standards of living and health and economic prosperity over time, I think about the advance of technology as the primary driver of that. Of course, the advance of technology also has very serious implications for national security, both in the kinds of tools that are available to a government like the United States and in the kinds of tools that are available to various kinds of adversaries. So the question I want to ask at an open-ended level is, technology is great for prosperity, but what about security? Has, in the last, say, 2 decades, Rob earlier used 20 years ago, before the internet, before a lot of other things. In the last 2 decades, we've seen a lot of technological change. On net, has that tended to improve or really worsen, do you think, the national security of the United States or globally? Why don't we start with Juan and work our way back?
Well, Ben, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I think it's obviously been a net plus. Technology allows for creativity, growth, innovation. So at a baseline, in terms of sort of the economy and the way society has evolved, there's no question that it's net positive. There's also sort of a balance when you think about how technology, whether you're talking about social media or means of creating things, how that plays in the security domain, because we typically think of that as a very binary kind of question. And you have terrorists who can use new technologies against us. They can use social media to organize against us. Transnational actors can adapt quickly given new technologies. And so you have new types of threats that emerge given new technologies. But at the same time, you have new technologies that actually allow you to secure not just individuals, but public spaces and private spaces much more securely. So you think about supply chain security, for example. The new technologies that are brought to those systems actually create enormous amounts of security against not just those particular kinds of threats, but also for the integrity of the system itself. And so what's interesting to me is there's no question that technology allows for the kind of growth and creativity that we want. But it also allows for innovation in countering some of the ways that nefarious actors, destructive actors, would seek to use those technologies. And in many ways, it's in technology that you're probably going to find some of the best solutions to some of the thornier national security issues that we're facing.
Okay, so pick up, say, social media, for example. We have the sense, and I don't think I understand ISIS or ISIL very well, but they certainly seem to be savvy users of social media for recruiting and other means. Are we winning or losing sort of the social media battle in terms of terrorism? Selena, do you have a view?
Losing. So the two courses, if you'd like to spend a whole semester, that I teach are globalization, national security, and then the nexus between terrorism and crime. And when we take a look at social media, it's actually this question of how cyber has been an enabler for other ways that basically, whether it's governments or more importantly, transnational illicit actors, so those are terrorists and criminals, are leveraging cyber as a new domain. And what's happening is that you're giving them more power because the battlefield is really level. And it's a very interesting way. If you think about all the technologies that are used against us here in the United States, we are the cradle of innovation, right? In terms of all the things that are being used against us were actually invented and created and propagated within our realm. And what we're seeing, though, too, is globalization. And here we're at a business school, right? All these things that we look at as global supply chains that have made things like just-in-time inventory very beneficial for the private sector have actually really helped, particularly international criminal networks, really leverage globalization. So technology and communication is one part of the drivers of globalization. But just as it's a good, we've actually seen how other groups have been able to use it asymmetrically against great powers. And I think that's where we're going to be really the cutting edge question for the future for those of us in security is how we can work better with the private sector in terms of kind of leveraging that knowledge of what's good, but more importantly, I always look at how it could be used for evil agendas. And sadly, the internet and the social media campaign of ISIL is a great example. And sadly, it's really permeating in a lot of our households here that we're not very aware of. The kids who are playing on a lot of these Call of Duty, ISIS version, it looks like an innocent game for entertainment, but it's actually a way that they're reaching in and really being able to recruit in levels that we have never seen before.
So given this asymmetric, perhaps, warfare, if you will, in social media, Matt, your perspective from the Middle East, from the Pentagon for the last couple of years, a few years, how do we do better in terms of securing ourselves, given some of those challenges?
It's right. I think your question is right. The way I look at how do we secure ourselves and what the role of technology is, it really cuts in two ways. On one way, it's incredibly powerful. Another way, we're desperately caught behind. In one way, it's incredibly powerful. I remember early when I came onto the Pentagon, I went on a U.S. aircraft carrier, went through the Strait of Hormuz, and I stayed overnight. There's nothing as amazing as the manifestation of American military power as the United States aircraft carrier. It is a floating base which far outstrips what any other nation on the planet can project militarily around the world. On that ship, there's the most advanced fighter aircraft, radar, technology, things that can do with warfare, something that we cannot have imagined before. Now, what that does, it creates amazing amounts of optionality for American decision makers. So it allows either intervention at a lower risk to our soldiers, which not have been possible before. It's the same technology for drones. It's the same technology that also helps prevent new defenses. For example, Israel, one of the countries I used to be responsible for, there's a joint U.S.-Israeli defense cooperation program called the Iron Dome rocket defense system. So one of the biggest threats to Israel were rockets fired from the Gaza Strip. The Iron Dome rocket defense system can reduce that by an 80 to 90% success rate, meaning that only 10 to 20% of the rockets can get into Israel proper that wouldn't before. Now, that's a fundamental game changer, because when you can provide that type of protection, you also create decision-making space, which stops retaliation and escalation, which can allow to greater warfare. Now, that's the enormous power and promise of things that something is amazing. The biggest and most disappointing part about the role of technology now is not something that the Defense Department is responsible for, but it's something that I think is actually the greatest national security challenge in the Middle East and other places, and that's job creation. You know, the problem in the Middle East is not as much the threat of rockets or even missiles or submarines or all the other advanced technologies they have. It's the fact that in the Middle East, half of the population is under the age of 25. And it is the unemployment rate that is highest amongst that group of most of these places. And in these countries, you have an incredibly well-connected group of people. I mean, one study found that of Saudis ages 18 to 24, 89% of them own a smartphone. Now, the real failure of technology in these countries is when unemployment is so high, when a real cause of instability in these countries is the lack of good economic opportunity, job creation, we have not thought creatively enough as a government, I think, and partnerships with the private sector about how to use technology to create more jobs. And as a result, I can go to the Middle East as often as I do and have defense discussions, but even the most senior officials who I talk to aren't just interested in American defense technology, which they're very, very interested in, but how can we harness the power of American entrepreneurship and technology to help them solve their job creation problems, which I still feel like we really don't have a very good answer for.
Okay, so we can have a lot of disenfranchised people in a situation where there's poor economic prospects. You've got some technology where they can all interact and get together, and that's sort of a match in the fuel together, and that's an insecure situation.
Hugely.
On the other hand, you know, so we, as a country with a lot of allies, spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, for example, or in Iraq, with a military mission, but also with a prosperity mission, hoping for exactly this reason to sort of provide economic opportunity and prosperity, and therefore diminish the interests of the people there in engaging in conflict. You know, looking back over that, Juan, what's your view? I mean, that's a playbook. I'm a development economist, so I know that playbook's pretty hard. But you know, have we learned something from those experiences? Can we do better now? Is there a role we could play, say, in the Middle East at this point, or do we just kind of have to stand back and hope it, you know, kind of contain it?
It's a great question. I think we've learned some hard lessons. We've been, I think, unable to harness what are some great opportunities. There's a good editorial in the New York Times today talking about the failure to harness the mining, extract, and mineral wealth in Afghanistan, and really the lost opportunity, not just from the military side, but from the USAID and the private sector, to actually develop the infrastructure to allow Afghanistan to have a self-sustaining industry that will benefit them in the region for years to come. And so I think one of the great and unfortunate lessons of the past decade is the fact that we've been unable to figure out what that positive economic playbook looks like. To Matt's point, in general terms, how do we create prosperity on a broader basis in conflict zones in particular? But I think, you know, what we really struggle with is how do you find ways where government and the private sector can really work together, either in coordination or in parallel, to create opportunities. And the Afghan mining sector is a great example of that, where huge opportunity over the past few years to do that, and we've really faltered. We haven't done that well, and we're now on the verge of leaving Afghanistan, seeing a rather imperfect system left in place with all sorts of questions for the Afghans themselves. I also think, you know, we've seen technology itself sort of leapfrog even our intentions. That is to say, even in Afghanistan, for example, you've had the rise of mobile banking in ways that have been very helpful, some of which has been stoked and spawned by the U.S. government, some of which has been market-driven and organic. You've seen the development of payment systems like M-Pesa in Kenya, which are these innovative payment systems in East Africa, again, driven somewhat by government support, but somewhat organically by the marketplace, in Southeast Asia as well. And so, you know, technology in many ways has a way of leapfrogging even the impediments in a system. And as I was saying at the start, I think really does provide an opportunity to think about what are some novel solutions to some endemic development and economic problems in places where, frankly, the standard forms of government power and influence just aren't nimble enough and, frankly, aren't effective enough to get us to where we need to go. And so I think one of the lessons of the last 12 years, and to answer your final and hard question, do we get more involved? I think we can't afford not to be involved. We have to be part of a broader solution. But does that mean we need 100,000 troops in all the conflict zones around the world? Of course not. But it does mean we have to help figure out what are some long-term solutions to these endemic problems that will inevitably fester and create problems for the United States, whether it's here in the homeland or for our interests abroad. And so I think part of that is figuring out how do you harness the private sector, how do you harness technology to leapfrog the endemic problems that have existed in some of these societies.
So just so if I'm interpreting you correctly, you kind of want to get around the government intermediary. So taking the mobile money example, maybe there are ways we can do development in the field that don't require us to deal with some of the challenges with governance.
I think that's exactly right. And there's one example in Afghanistan. It's an inspiring example, but it's also tragic in the way that it represents sort of these failings in the system. There's an organization called Spirit of America, an NGO that was created by some American patriots that wanted to do everything possible to help the military. The reality was the generals in the field who were trying to influence on the ground in places like Afghanistan, in villages that needed blankets and shoes and very basic things, were finding that they just couldn't deliver in real time in ways that were going to affect the battlefield in the days and weeks that they were having to deal with them. And so this organization worked with the Pentagon, created an NGO, and is now, in essence, a jump team for the kinds of resources the military needs. And so when the military needs blankets in the field or shoes in these particular pockets where Spirit of America works, they don't go back to USAID, they don't go back to the Pentagon. They go to this NGO and they say, look, we need, within 48 hours, blankets and shoes for this village to support the efforts in the field. And so that's an example of a new model of more flexible, nimble, and real-time foreign policy that relies on the private sector and less on sort of the big behemoth elements of the U.S. government.
Very interesting. To pick up this theme of finance, maybe take it in a slightly different direction, Selena. So the U.S. government has developed, apart from terrorist finance, more mechanisms. You and Juan work together on this as sanctions against states and other things. So, for example, Iran or Russia are subject to certain kinds of targeted financial sanctions against individuals or organizations, and this has become a new tool in the toolkit of diplomacy and security. So at this point, what's your sense, Selena? Are these really effective new tools that are increasing security or preventing us from going in different ways? What's your take on it?
So we call it the financial instrument of national power. And actually, Juan's written a book about it. And actually, what Juan developed, I exported at the State Department 10 years ago, trying to figure out how other countries can apply similar techniques. Because it's the balloon effect, right? So if other countries are not imposing, and more importantly, actually respecting the sanctions on countries like Iran and North Korea and Russia, it actually doesn't help. And what has been seen and proven is there had been a lot of body of knowledge developed about how sanctions never worked. For example, the case of Cuba. But in the case of Iran, and I think Juan would agree with me, it really did bring Iran to the table in terms of basically bringing them to their knees economically in order to kind of see what the way forward would be. And sanctions relief is the #1 agenda item for the Iranians. What we're seeing, though, there are some limitations. So this is much easier, by the way, than actually being grilled by congressional testimony last Thursday on the same topic.
I try to be nicer
on
then.
ISIL, so it's much friendlier. And even though I need a visa to be here, because I did go to Harvard Business School. But
you are very welcome.
It's okay.
You are very welcome.
But more importantly, we need to kind of be much more nimble and, in the spirit of kin, much more innovative. Okay. So for groups like ISIL that are not necessarily using the international banking system, we need to figure out what will work against specific targets that we're looking at. And I think that's the bigger question. So they work against nation states and they work against groups. So the way it works actually is we name and then we shame. Then we freeze their assets, and then in certain situations, seize their assets. And they always talk about, I do a lot of work in Mexico and Colombia, and they always say that the drug lords fear two things. Actual extradition to the United States, to a solitary cell without a cell phone. And the other thing that they worry about is that you take their money away. So actually what we're seeing is a much more aggressive way that other partner nations are using sanctions, but also something called taking their money away, which is asset forfeiture. And as the economies develop and there are new innovations, we have to really keep up with technology and, more importantly, different ways that actually these groups, there are 4 stages: how they raise money, how they move money, how they store money, and how they actually spend the money. And what we're looking at, particularly in the realm of terrorism, it's getting dangerous when we're starting to see them spending that money, in particularly pre-planning for operations. So what we're trying to do is think about how other countries could kind of use the same lessons learned and apply that skill set of this financial instrument of national power.
Okay, great. And just to dig deeper on one metaphor you gave, Cuba, sanctions for a long time, doesn't seem to work. Maybe eventually. Iran, there's a sense that it did seem to work. What exactly are the financial mechanisms that are the difference if you were to
Well, if you think about it, so Cuba is actually quite an insular economy, and it did have its sphere of influence in terms of trading partners, particularly in terms of their vital requirements like oil. The relationship with Venezuela was critical. But when you take a look at Iran in terms of global, if you're actually being denied access to an oil market, and more importantly, the financial wherewithal, you're actually, the idea that we've always had about using that financial instrument is actually suffocating your adversary from basically having the oxygen, which is money. And that's really this concept that we've used against al-Qaeda in Iraq, against the Taliban and the Haqqani network in Afghanistan. And that's a bigger question. It's actually, the last 10 years, we've seen tremendous uses of what we call financial intelligence to help us target. And this big operation that was just conducted in Syria against Abu Saif, who we consider the CFO of ISIL, was literally going after what is a financial CFO as opposed to, let's say, the head. Not that we're not looking for him, I just want to reassure people that. But it's an interesting way that we're becoming much more comprehensive in the way we define national security and also take a look at communications, financing, their physical presence on social media. And it's a very much of a team effort, which I think is sadly the real lesson of 9/11, how we could better cooperate within the government, with other governments. And as Juan's underscored, we really need the help of the private sector.
Great. Juan, you want to jump in?
Just very quickly,
Please.
Selena's absolutely right when she's laid out. The difference between pre-9/11 and post-9/11, and the difference between what are considered to be classic trade sanctions that were applied to Cuba traditionally for the past few decades, and now, is that these are strategies of financial exclusion, right? So the idea is, how do you unplug rogue actors from the global system? The financing that they need, the insurance that they need, the shipping. And so it's less about hermetically sealing a country, and it's more about unplugging them from a system, right? That's the conceptual difference. And that was not the system that was applied to Cuba. Cuba had this traditional approach, much like the sanctions against Iraq, which were largely country-based, largely trade-based, largely dictated by diplomacy. What you had in the wake of the terrorist financing campaign to go after al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups' financial flows was an attempt to define groups like not just terrorist groups and criminal actors, but also North Korea, Iran, and other rogue states as threats to the international security order as well as the international financial system. And so one of the reasons isolation of Iran has proven so devastating in the last 10 years as opposed to the last 3 decades of sanctions against Iran is that there was an all-out campaign to define Iran as illicit actors themselves, engaged in money laundering, terrorist financing, proliferation financing, sanctions evasion, and a whole suite of problems that then the private sector had to react to. And it was really sort of putting reputational risk at the center of the debate, making it the coin of the realm, so to speak, to force the private sector to make very hard decisions. You either want to do business in the U.S. or not. And if you want to do business with rogue actors, you're going to be cut off from the U.S. system. And that really became the driving impetus for this new form of financial exclusion, which is really at the heart of these new campaigns.
So the answer to my question may be that there's no alternative, so it doesn't matter. But I'm thinking a bit about, China has recently started a new World Bank-like organization, and the U.S., somewhat to its chagrin, has seen numerous of our allies, in fact, apparently be willing to join that organization. And that's probably there for China's motive are multifaceted, I'm sure, but there's sometimes a sense that if the U.S. has this power, it can use tools like the international financial architecture to meet sort of security interests. And if other countries believe that we're meeting our personal interests as opposed to sort of global interests, does that ultimately come back and bite us in the hand because people then want to move away from these systems that we think are so important? Do you think that's a real risk, with regard to, say, Russia or Iran, if we're going to be going in and using these financial systems as tools of security, or not? Is this a serious concern or not?
I think it is. It's something I wrote about in my book, Chapter 16, Forecasting.
Which I've read.
It's called Treasury's War, by the way, if anyone's interested.
Very good book, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that very much. No, I think it is a real concern. One is there's an organic sort of challenge to the American global order, especially after 2008 anyway, right? And you've got the rise of China. And I think China would be creating the AIIB anyway, even if they weren't trying to oppose the U.S. But you do see a real challenge to the U.S. Economic order, challenge to the dollar, and the creation of alternate systems. So you've got the Chinese and Russians now talking about alternate payment systems. They're talking about creating an alternative to the SWIFT system, the bank messaging system that's used globally by most of the banks around the world. They've created trading relationships to avoid the use of dollar clearing, which is one of the mechanisms we use to be able to freeze assets as money traverses through New York. And so there's no question that that's a problem and a potential negative externality of using these powers too much. I think a safeguard here is relying on the fact that these powers are used in advancement of internationally accepted norms and principles, right? We're not just advocating some radical U.S. point of view. These are international norms. We just happen to be enforcing them. Case in point, this morning, the Department of Justice has indicted members of FIFA for corruption charges. Russia has already come out and complained to say, why is it your business, U.S., to enforce this? This seems like a use of hyperpower from a legal perspective and in terms of corruption. And that's the same complaint you've heard from, for example, the major global banks that have been hit by billions of dollars of fines. But the reality is, if we're basing those actions on real facts, real delicts, real international norms that are agreed to be sort of outside the bounds, I think we are in very good stead. A good example of that is, despite all the protestations from the French government and BNP Paribas after the nearly $9 billion fine for sanctions violations, BNP Paribas didn't leave New York. They actually moved their core compliance function from Paris to New York. And so it's a real interesting question, and I think it's a delicate balance, because I do think we have to be careful as to how much we use our overarching power globally. But I don't think we should shirk from using that power when it's in our interest and when it's in international interest. And I think converging that and making it clear becomes a very important part of the use of our power.
Yeah. I think you raised the excellent point of that is, I think one of the most interesting innovations of the use of force, there are a whole range of new technologies that allow the U.S. to deploy force in a more precise way, in a more direct way, with less immediate seeming cost to us. So if you go in the White House Situation Room now, a large part of the discussions will be what can Treasury bring to the table for financial sanctions or financial tools. There's a huge amount that U.S. Special Operation Forces are able to do. The raid against Osama bin Laden in the Abbottabad compound was only one that after hundreds of those that happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have new technologies, that drones and other things that can get things done, and you don't look at it necessarily in the same way that you do deploying a brigade of U.S. forces. The problem is there are all these knock-on effects that we might not be thinking of that much. Take, for example, drones. What drones might be seen as a low-cost form of warfare not only has a blowback within countries, but now a new proliferation of this technology throughout the world. The financial crimes, the thing that Juan talked about. With special forces, there is a danger that we may think that just because we have this hammer, that things start looking like a nail. And increasingly, if you, I think, look at what technology is doing, we have much more technology to break things down than to build them up. And the problem will be is we can break things down much faster without knowing what to come in its place. Iran, for example, is a country that we want to bring to the table for its nuclear negotiations, for its destabilizing other weapons that they have for their terrorist activities, but we fundamentally don't need to worry about building up Iran as a nation. It's a nation where its government has made bad choices, has taken the international system. If you look at Syria, for example, or Libya, it is it's not easy, but it was easier to put pressure on these countries, and now even a country that's as oil-rich and resource plenty as Libya, very, very hard to bring that together. And I think, again, there's a tech problem that our offensive technology is still outpacing our ability to deal with the consequences. And I think that's the real thing for us to try to deal with, which is extraordinarily hard.
So actually, so Matt, let's stick with this, but let's also come to the security apparatus of the United States as a whole, and the Pentagon maybe in particular. So technology is changing. We have new kinds of threats. We've talked about, say, social media with regard to terrorism, recruiting. We haven't talked much about cybersecurity, but of course that's a big new one now with the proliferation of drones, perhaps as a follow-on from our own activities. You know, in a business setting, I think of, you know, the environment's changing. You develop a strategy as an organization, okay, but then you also need to develop an organization internally that can meet those strategic objectives externally. So I guess the question is how has, say, the Pentagon or other apparatus in the U.S. government changed the org chart, if you will, to meet social media concerns, cybersecurity concerns? Are we able to shift internally and effectively, do you think, to meet these kinds of new challenges?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, in the government, as you know, probably elsewhere, the key currency of government power is how many meetings are you invited to, basically. It's a very
in the sit room.
in the situation room. And there are levels of that, you know.
And then oval.
There's the situation room, and then there's the side room, and then if you're in Purgatory, the old executive office building, you walk all the way across the street. And then someone I remember once said, you know, it's really funny, am I in trouble because I feel like there are meetings going on? I'm just not invited to anyone. And that's
It's like
sort of
a teenager on Facebook. Right?
Yeah. So knowing that that's a currency, one thing, Ben, that I think has been interested is, so the question is, who is sitting around the table in the situation room? You know, and if you go back and see pictures of the Cuban Missile Crisis, clearly you have defense, intelligence agencies, the president, the vice president. Now it would be crazy to have these discussions without having Treasury at the table. When you talk about cybersecurity, you have the Department of Homeland Security there. With the Iran nuclear negotiations, you have the Secretary of Energy being right there too. So I think organizationally, there's been a proliferation that national security is almost in every agency within the US government. And I think the hard thing about that, though, is how do you think about how to innovate and deal with that? So I think we're much better at realizing how you need to use the different tools of government power together. What we're less good at doing is having conversations like are happening here within the government. You know, if you talk in the government about a startup, you'll talk about Google or Facebook. Well, these are massive public companies that have been doing this for a while. Not to talk about what it really means to bring in innovative technology. Or at least even if you look at talent, which I think is one of the hardest things that we look further. I mean, when I was in my job at the Pentagon, I probably talked to 10 or 20 people a week who are desperate to get a job working on the Middle East and the US government. And sadly, the answer is there's a hiring freeze to hire civilians in the Pentagon right now, which is terrible. So our problem's not just we need to find a way to get the people who want to work at startups to actually come into the government to bring that same idea and energy in, not have the standard practice that we had before, and it's hugely problematic right now.
Ben, can I just
Please.
address this? Because I think the government tries to adapt, and I think in the cyber context, for example, the creation of Cyber Command and all of the commands within the various services to deal with cyber issues in defense is a reflection of that. Capabilities within the Department of Homeland Security, which are getting better. They're not great, but they're getting better. But the reality is, the reality of the world is outpacing the structures of 1947. The National Security Act of 1947, which set the structures, the authorities, the decision-making for the government on national security, were from a post-World War II era. And I think the major challenge we're facing now, and you see it time and time again, is when you have both cross-cutting issues that don't have neat definitions that fit into one department or agency or category, something like a cybersecurity, which impacts the entire country and the national economy. Who's responsible for that? Right? That's still a major debate within the government. With these meetings that we have, and they feel like Groundhog's Day sometimes, are literally about who's in charge. Right? And so it's very hard in that sense. And secondly, when you have issues that really can be impacted more effectively, if not more efficiently, by non-state actors. And so, you know, we've spent a lot of time over the last 15 years worrying about how non-state actors can hurt us. What we haven't quite figured out is how do we leverage non-state actors to actually work with us and in parallel to deal with these issues. And so you look at, let's take three issues. One, this financial exclusion strategy. Part of the magic of that was figuring out how do you align the major global banks, like it or not, with U.S. interests and with international principles. And so that's been an example of that. Two, how do you deal with cybersecurity when over 80% of the cyber infrastructure is in private sector's hands? You know, the whole point of the cyber legislation has been to try to create more information sharing. You know, that's just a drop in the bucket, because the reality is that the national economy relies on the cyber infrastructure, and the government just isn't organized and can't be organized to deal with it based on the structures. And third, you saw the White House host what they call the Countering Violent Extremism Summit. You know, we all struggled with this for years. How do you counter the ideology that's driving the motivation for people to be radicalized, to be mobilized, for Al-Qaeda, now the Islamic State to recruit, their use of social media, the internet? How do you counter that? Well, the answer is it's not going to come from the pulpit of the White House press briefing room, and it's not going to come from the State Department talking points or something that U.S. ambassador says. It's going to come from within communities and credible voices that can actually push back, delegitimate, mock, do all the things that you would do to counter a narrative and an ideology, you know, much of which you all know well. That relies on private sector actors, startups. How do you get Muslim youth and millennials engaged? And so we are just starting to grapple with how do you engage in geopolitical power in the 21st century when that power is diffuse and when, frankly, we're reliant on the private sector to do much of it, if not most of it.
And actually, an interesting example of that interaction in the news this morning is this breach at the IRS, where people are able to go to the IRS, cyber criminals, and get millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars in refunds using information they stole from Home Depot or others. Exactly. So these things all play back on each other. I want to close our discussion with a personal question, if you will, to all three of you, and maybe to get there. You guys were talking a bit about being invited to meetings in the White House in the Situation Room. I had the wonderful opportunity and privilege to work in the White House in the first term of the Obama administration as an economist. And so I went to the Situation Room for a meeting exactly one time. Which means I wasn't very important. And then why would I ever go to the Situation Room as an economist? Well, the reason for that is because most of the building was under construction for quite a while, and so there weren't very many conference rooms. So it could happen that the only available conference room was a sit room. I'm not kidding. And when you walk into the sit room, you know, there's a list of the meetings that are going on. And let me tell you, the topics on the board are pretty interesting. It's like, well, this is like really serious stuff. And they're there at the bottom, budget. That was my meeting. So I went to the federal budget meeting, and one of my colleagues quipped, "This must be the wonkiest meeting ever to take place in the Situation Room."
Or was a code name for the most interesting meeting there the entire time.
No. But you know, working in security affairs in particular, working in public service is not the highest compensated of all careers. Working in security is very high stress. When I walk into that room, I see the topics on the board. I know the hours, you know, people are working. And the seriousness and the gravity of the issues. You know, it's a big thing to do that as a career. And I want to just ask you, maybe I'll start with you, Selena. You know, you chose a career in public service, and you've chosen a career dealing with security issues and all that entails. Why did you make that choice?
So I actually always wanted to be a diplomat, so I was at the State Department, first out of my class at Georgetown to actually make it as a Foreign Service officer at a time when we were really taking advantage of the dividend, the peace dividend, after the Cold War. So majoring in European and NATO studies was probably not a good leading indicator, right? Then I actually took a sabbatical and went to business school at Harvard, joined a different foreign service called Goldman Sachs International. And little did I know, not following the path of several partners who preceded me, would I be called back into service. So just by way of background, and Rob knows this, I basically was covering European and more importantly, Middle Eastern accounts. And literally a month after September 11th, and through my connections, having run the White House Situation Room a couple of years before, was called to service. And when General Powell and his team ask you to do something, you really should never say no to a 4-star general. And it was a great opportunity to meld private sector, but more importantly, public sector. And I ended up sitting at the State Department to actually export what are our best practices. And then instead of leaving, when I left the State Department, instead of actually going back into the private sector, I actually have brought the Harvard Business School case study method to teach security at the National Defense University. You're called to duty to do different things, and I think it just depends. Anywhere any of us sit, we can actually promote prosperity and security, and I think that's what my real kind of message today is, irrespective of where industry you're in. there are so many ways that you can actually influence and, more importantly, impact national security, because it's really the responsibility of every citizen of every country, and even in little ways that you don't know. And I'm from New York, so you always say, see something, say something. But you'd be surprised how many of those tips from the public actually help us to keep our nation safe. So with that, it's been a really interesting career. And it's always good to have that MBA in the back pocket for when you want to go out and kind of supplement the government salary.
We could record that as a...
That's correct.
That's great. Glad to hear that. Matt, you, in fact, we were within 1 week, I think, of your formal departure from the Pentagon. After, we've known each other quite a long time, but you've been in there 6 years, at least.
Over 6 years,
I know, at times working hundreds of hours, 100-hour week after week after week. I remarked when I saw Matt today, I can't believe how good you look. I thought you looked so healthy.
That's always scary when someone says that to you.
It didn't take long to bounce back, I guess. But why public service for you, and what's next, actually?
So for me, for public service, to me, it always felt like this calling. I mean, my dad was in the Army. He was a JAG officer, and there are things that are just amazing about it. Like you're in the White House, and you can't believe you're actually there sometimes. I mean, every day there's sort of 15 front page stories on your desk that most of them will never see the light of day. And you're in these amazing places. And I remember I was in one meeting, and my boss at the time, the National Security Advisor, said, when people talk about like there's the meeting in the room, and sometimes there's like another room that the actual meeting's going on, the decisions are being made. Like, this is the room. Like, there's no other meeting. People aren't leaving after this to actually do what's happening. This is where the decisions are being made. And that's just an amazing experience for anything you're doing. But for me, the thing that I really did it is, and especially the Pentagon now, is the thing that's been most amazing about doing is basically serving the men and women in uniform. That's what it means to be a civilian political appointee for a president, right? I'm not going to be there very long. 6 years is a long time in. But when I think about it, my dad, who was in the military his whole career, really impacted me to try to do something that could just have a really big impact. And for me, when I had different choices about what not to do, I remember when we knew each other in Chicago before I came in, I had finished a clerkship for a federal judge here, and I was either going to be a prosecutor or work for a law firm. And I took this job that my mom couldn't believe I took, an unpaid job on the campaign. And I worked on it, and mom was like, someone will actually pay you money to do another job. And of this, you found a way to not only go to a lot of grad schools, a lot of like letters, and find the one unpaid job that you can find. And she's like, that is talent. And it was the best career decision I ever made, because it was that feeling that you wake up and you feel like there's nowhere else you'd rather be in the world. There's nothing else you'd rather be doing. And I even felt that, it seems cheesy to say, on those really, really hard days when you have gotten there at 7 in the morning and you leave at 11 at night and you spend all day trying to push a boulder up a hill. But it's that feeling that you just can have a huge impact, work with amazing people. And for me, that's what really drove it.
Great. Speaking of decisions, Juan, you've been involved with lots of very serious security decisions and others in policy. Would you be willing to share a choice you've been involved with that has been especially gratifying, or an innovation you've done that's especially gratifying, or maybe even challenging emotionally?
Well, I'll share with you the most gratifying moment, I think, professionally, when I was at the White House. Part of my portfolio obviously was the counterterrorism portfolio, but part of it also was a whole range of other issues, to include hostage policy. And so we had to worry about all the missing American citizens around the world, and we kept pictures of those people on my desk. And we would host meetings, and we were doing everything possible to get folks out. And it was often hopeless, difficult, and really challenging, especially dealing with the families, of course. But in this one case, we had 3 American citizens who had been held hostage by the Colombian terrorist group, the narco-trafficking group FARC, for 5 years in the jungles of Colombia. We had been working with the Colombian government to try to find them. And thanks to the great work of the Colombian military, the U.S. military, the intelligence services, we were actually able to track them down. And we knew we were getting close. And so it was about a year to go before the end of the Bush administration. And a lot of people were leaving. It tends to be a time when people start heading for the hills a bit. And I had a conversation with my wife, and she said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to stay to the end, in part because I think I can have an impact. But there are two things I want to get done. One, I want to find bin Laden, which we didn't get done in time. But we made some progress, and thanks to the Obama administration and the Navy SEALs, we got them. And two, I want to get our guys out of Colombia. Because I think we can, and I think it's going to happen, and I want to make sure we stay focused on that. So in June of '08, the Colombians launched one of the most spectacular hostage rescue ventures ever. They spoofed the FARC into thinking that there was a humanitarian mission underway. They had isolated the command and control of the FARC leadership so that there was no way to backstop the communications that were being spoofed. The Colombians manufactured, with our help, the transfer of these high-level hostages to include the 3 Americans who were embedded among the 15, to include Ingrid Betancourt. You recall she was a presidential candidate who had been held hostage as well. And the Colombians took the hostages. And we were following that from the White House. We didn't have video screens, but we had telephones. And I remember the call, because I was relaying it to the Oval Office, when the guys were on the helicopter. And they said, we've got them, they're safe. And I burst out crying, because it's very rare in that kind of a job that you're able to celebrate good news, or even able to sort of feel tangibly that your work actually mattered, in a way that you can witness today. And the fact that we saved 3 guys' lives that we've been trying to get home to their families, that it was done in such a spectacular way by the Colombians, and that I was able to play a little part in that, that to me was the best professional day of my life, probably ever will be. And so I talked to Steve Hadley. I said, they're safe, we've got it. And he said, let's tell the president. Went over to the Oval Office. The president had a call with President Uribe of Colombia. And let me just relay this, because I think this is indicative of President Bush's character. I know he's controversial and folks don't like some decisions he made, but this is indicative of his character. President Uribe got on the phone with President Bush to give him the good news. And he told President Bush, you should go out and make a statement. You should celebrate this. This is our sort of success. And President Bush said, no. One, it's work that you've done and the Colombians have done, so you should take credit for it. And two, the most important thing right now is to get these 3 back to their family. So we're not going to do anything to interrupt that. It wasn't until 3 months later that we quietly had the 3 into the Oval Office. We hosted them. We celebrated. And to me, that was a highlight of my time at the White House, because I was able to actually make some sort of a difference, I think, or at least be a part of a team that made a difference. And for me, coming from an immigrant family, my mother coming from Cuba, father from Mexico, it's the highest privilege to be able to say you served as an American official. I mean, it's an unbelievable honor. And to Matt's point, every day I left the White House, I would have to pinch myself looking at the West Wing, thinking, I actually get to work here. So, to me, it's a great honor to serve, and to serve with purpose. And I think you can do it in the private sector as well. And I think that's a message I give to students whenever I lecture, is to say, it's not just, highfalutin, titles in government where you can make a difference. It's innovation, it's creativity, and it's job creation that at the end of the day will make a difference in people's lives. So go do it.
Well, thank you for sharing those perspectives, that story as well. Thank you all for your public service. Thank you all for joining us. This has been such a great conversation. We've run out of time, which hurts me, because I think I could go on for another hour. I'm not sure if you guys want to, but so many more questions to ask. But please join me in thanking our panelists.
Selena, called to serve. Juan, serve with purpose. Ben, it's great to be at Kellogg because of people like you. So here's a guy who's a great teacher, a great researcher, and has a diverse background and experiences. It takes a lot of insight to ask questions like that. toe-to-toe with a group like this. I've known Matt and Selena for some time, and it's been really exciting to follow their careers on the side, here and there. An email, I think Matt, once every year, we'd have an email. Selena, I get to see your Facebook postings on a regular basis, and I like almost all of them. It's great.
After I leave that country.
Yeah, yes, exactly, exactly. Juan and I met through the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he was in town to speak for them and said, would you like him to come to Kellogg? And I said, oh my gosh, former Deputy National Security Advisor. Are you kidding? We set it up. I'm all excited. I'm thinking, that's pretty hot stuff. That's pretty good. And then who comes to campus? President Obama at exactly the same time. So I thought, all right, that's kind of blowing my parade. Anyway, Juan
Needless
comes.
to say, we didn't get a huge crowd.
Well, now wait a minute. But to your great credit, Juan. So here's what happened. While Obama's 4 helicopters were dropping, and his limo was dropping him off, Juan came in, and we had, what, about 35 or 40 students. And he was speaking just before the president for about an hour. It was a great conversation. And we decided, hey, it would be nice to simulcast the president's speech into the room. Scott, you were there, right? So we simulcast the speech into the room, and Juan said, oh, hey, I'd love to watch. I said, hey, stay. So here we had Kellogg students sitting in the room watching President Obama make his remarks across campus with Juan Zarate. And after, what did Juan do? He spent another hour chatting with the students about his perspective serving government. Called to serve, purpose to serve. Thank you so much to all of you for your commitment to our country and to the world. It's great to have you here. Thank you. Ben, great, great.